Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our conference. My name is Keisha Allan, and I'm from the Comparative Literature Department. My colleague Sarah Dowman and I will be moderating this panel entitled Migration as a Form of Education and a Transfer of Ideas in Present-day Americas. Our panelists are Adriana Sanchez Perez, Cheryl Hansen, and Marta Dominguez. Our first presenter, Adriana Sanchez Perez, is a senior at the University of Maryland. While majoring in international relations, she is pursuing a minor in Latin American studies. A native from Puerto Rico, Adriana is a feminist who supports the decolonization of Puerto Rico. Adriana's presentation is entitled "¿Y tú haces aquí? Grievances of an Afro-Caribbean Before and After Migrating to the Diaspora." Our second presenter, Cheryl Hansen, is a junior at the University of Maryland. She is pursuing a double major in psychology and Spanish and a minor in nonprofit leadership and social innovation. Cheryl developed a passion for learning about other cultures and working with Latinx populations in the United States. Cheryl's presentation is entitled "The Role of Cross-Cultural Interactions in Developing White Allyship to Latinx Immigrants." Our final presenter is Marta Dominguez. Marta is a student at the University of Maryland, where she studies psychology and minors in Latin American studies. She was born in Peru and migrated to the United States in 2012. Marta is passionate about learning more about other Latin American countries. Marta's presentation is entitled "An Exploration of Feminism Consciousness in Relation to Gender Roles and Education." I would like to alert you to the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen for presentations in Spanish. You should select English and then mute the original audio, mute the microphone using the microphone icon at the bottom left of your screen. So we will begin our presentations. Of course, you can post your questions in the Q&A for our panelists. We will begin with Adriana. So feel free to start.
Thank you. Sure. Let me share my screen really quick. All right, do you guys see my screen? Cool. Awesome. So as it was said before, the name of our presentation is Migration as a Form of Education and the Transfer of Ideas in the Present-day Americas. And before I start my individual presentation, I want to kind of set the floor, letting you guys know why we connected in this panel. Cheryl, Martha, and I will be presenting about 3 distinctive oral histories of women that we find very inspiring and are currently residing in the United States. While we interviewed these women, we were able to connect individual experiences and events to one collective history. We will discuss their experience, their notion of society, of feminism, policies, and racial inequalities. We argue that these women, after migrating, went through a process of unlearning and reflecting their own experience as women from the United States, the Caribbean, and South America. So, ¿y qué tú haces aquí? Grievances of an Afro-Caribeña before and after migrating to the United States. I will be talking about the experience of a Puerto Rican woman before and after migrating to the United States. I will also reflect on how colonialism has affected the lives of many Puerto Ricans in the island and outside the island. So for this oral history research, I interviewed Velez. To give you guys a little background on my relationship with this person, she is the daughter of my godmother, so I was practically raised alongside of her, but she's 35 years old, so we have a pretty big age gap. But I always find it interesting on how we were able to always communicate really well and discuss our ideas. I don't know, kind of like a safe space almost. Velez migrated to Savannah, Georgia in 2017, and I wanted to ask and I wanted to know what was her experience as a Puerto Rican woman. But before I get into her experience in the United States, I would like to briefly explain the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. We often hear this, status talk, what's going on. And we're usually educated on the side that Puerto Rico is a commonwealth, that Puerto Rico is not a colony, but I defer. Puerto Rico has been a colony of the United States since 1898. And this imperialism that we Puerto Ricans have been subjugated to has affected our daily lives. It has forced migration to the United States. It has affected our education, our economy, all social relations, and so on. And throughout my discussion and my interview with Velez, I think she kind of enforces that. She kind of talks about that colonial relationship, and she saw the similarities and differences in some aspects in the Puerto Rico system. Velez was born and raised in Bayamón, Puerto Rico. There she completed her bachelor's and master's degree in ecology. During her time as a graduate, she was offered the opportunity to teach at a high school. So at 22 years old, she kind of experienced the exploitation that teachers go through in Puerto Rico because the pay is very low and the educational system in the island is very careless. With that being said, she made some comments about this, and I wanted to play the audio of her expressing herself. I also posted the translation in English for non-Spanish speakers.
Es bien difícil porque el sistema educativo de Puerto Rico es una porquería. Es el mismo sistema educativo que aquí en Estados Unidos, es un sistema educativo que no sirve, que no es bueno pedagógicamente, que está obsoleto, que va atemperado con otros tiempos que no son los de ahora. La diferencia con Estados Unidos y Puerto Rico es que, bueno, aquí en Estados Unidos tú tienes estructura. Bueno, aquí en Estados Unidos tú tienes unas escuelas brutales, estructuralmente, pero tienes el mismo tipo de estudiantes. Cuando tú tienes estudiantes en universidad, tú tienes estudiantes que estudiaron aquí en Estados Unidos que carecen de lo mismo que carecen los estudiantes en Puerto Rico, que es pensamiento crítico, es lectura, es redacción. Y eso es lo que el sistema educativo no te provee. Entonces, pues en Puerto Rico es difícil porque pues, el gobierno no aporta mucho al departamento de educación, el sistema está obsoleto, las escuelas no son, estructuralmente no son las mejores facilidades.
I really hope that you guys heard that. Anyways, giving that argument that she said to me, I asked if that experience as a teacher made her realize that what we were taught of Puerto Rico being un Estado Libre Asociado or a Commonwealth, did she figure out that Puerto Rico was a colony during that time as a teacher? And she gave me it was kind of interesting looking at her perspective because she told me, Adriana, I kind of knew all the time. You take history classes, but the history classes that we take are very brief. About Puerto Rico, we know nothing. But she did enforce that, and she attributed that when she started teaching, she saw that colonial relation with the United States because children that she was teaching, they were kind of exposed to a system that really didn't care about them, to a government that was absent almost. And I do agree with her. I have to say, Puerto Rico is like she said, like a copy paste from the US. We barely know our own history of our island. We barely know about the struggle of liberation. People who fought for liberation are often demonized in the island, and they paint this picture of dependency that without the US, we will basically sink in the Caribbean, and that's it. And I mentioned before, that she migrated to the United States. And I kind of wanted to ask about her identity because in Puerto Rico, we barely talk about this, especially in schools. We often talk, when we're talking about race, we talk about American, what it's like to be an American. It's never almost like what it's like to be a Puerto Rican, how many identities exist in the island and so on. And so I don't have an audio for this because I kind of lost it. So I'm going to read it in Spanish. Ella dice, yo me considero una persona trigueña, pero si tengo que escoger, soy negra. La gente usualmente me pregunta si soy latina o hispana. Y en mi caso, pues es lo mismo. Ese cuestionamiento usualmente pasa, la cual se cuestiona mi negritud porque soy hispana o latina. Entonces, tengo que explicarle a la gente que me pregunta que, mira, en mi país yo soy trigueña. Nosotros somos una mezcla de 3 razas, somos esa mezcla que nos hace únicos. If you guys haven't heard this term before, because I know it's heavily used in the Caribbean, trigueña means a person that's not dark, but is also not white. So she expressed that with her brown skin, she has always been able to identify as trigueña, and that's totally fine when we're talking about race in Puerto Rico. And so I wanted to point out one of the things that she mentioned that for me, it was really problematic was the fact that she said that nosotros somos una mezcla de tres razas, like we're a mix of three races, because that's all we're thought about when we're talking about identity in Puerto Rico. You know, you're a mix of three races. You have Spaniard, you have Taino, and you have African in you. But I feel like that kind of invisibilize the African descent communities that are in the island, that are not native, that are not white, that also invisibilize the fact that there are Asian people in Puerto Rico who are Puerto Rican, and the migration of Arabs into Puerto Rico as well. And so I feel like that kind of narrative is a product of colonialism, of how we're put in this box and this is your identity. And it's almost put as, you know, this is great, you know, you're great, this is awesome, this is an awesome mix. But in reality, it's more deeper than that. And it's kind of like a thing that should not be able to, like, kids shouldn't be able to learn about this kind of thing, because it's hurtful for marginalized communities in the island. And so I asked Velez to follow up with her experience and when migrating to the United States and how she was able to face that. And so now I'm gonna read some quotes about her experience. I posted it in English as well, so you guys can read too. So she says, cuando yo llegué a los Estados Unidos y comencé a trabajar, yo pasé por una de las peores experiencias. Mi primer día en el trabajo, lo primero que hicieron fue preguntarme dónde yo era, y pues les contesté. Y uno de mis compañeros me pregunta, ¿y qué entonces aquí? Tú me voy hoy mismo para Puerto Rico. En una ocasión, ella pues, esto es una historia, this is a story that she told me that I was just like, what? That she was also too, like, kind of shocked about it. Yo fui a inspeccionar un barco y un gringo me dijo bien molesto, ¿de dónde tú eres? Y yo riendo me le digo, mira, hola, ¿cómo estás? Buenos días. Y el hombre vuelve y me pregunta, ¿de dónde tú eres? Y yo le hice un gesto de, pues, ¿por qué me está preguntando? Y él viene y me dice, ¿de dónde tú eres? Porque ese color de piel no es de aquí. Y yo me puse seria y yo le dije, yo soy de aquí, yo vivo aquí. Y el tipo vuelve con la pregunta y dice, ese color de piel no es de aquí y ese acento tampoco. Y Adriana, yo no podía creer esta mierda, todas estas agresiones que yo tuve que enfrentar, que yo no sé que yo iba a tener como experiencia. O sea, a mí me trataron de botar de mi trabajo, me hicieron el trabajo imposible. En muchas ocasiones recibía comentarios sobre mi acento, mi nivel de educación, porque muchas de los que ocupan estos puestos son militares. Entonces yo, siendo mujer, teniendo una maestría, teniendo un acento y puertorriqueña, yo tengo un problema aquí. And when she was talking about her experience, I couldn't help but, like, think about Lolita Lebron Soto. If you guys don't know who Lolita Lebron Soto, she's a Puerto Rican nationalist, very well known, very well loved in Puerto Rico. And she migrated to New York around the 1940s. And she faced a lot of discrimination for the fact that she was a woman, but she was also Puerto Rican. And so this is one of the things that she said. She said, what we're facing in the United States was difficult. I felt bad that I and many of my compatriots had to leave our homeland and search for work only to land in a place that did not want us. And I just found that correlation kind of, like, not funny, but like contra. This happened in 1940. This was Lolita expressing 1940s, and now we're in 2017. And Velez is going through the same exact thing. She had to leave the island to look for work, and she landed in a place where she's not welcome to. And when she was talking about her experience as a Black Puerto Rican woman in the United States, you know, I mentioned that it reminded me of that, but I also mentioned, you know, ask her to that she faced in her life. And I'm gonna put an audio again. The transcript is on the back.
5 minutes.
Y me mudé en el 2017. Y estuvo fuerte. Para mí ha sido bien fuerte, ha sido desastroso. He pasado por unas de cosas que tú dices, ¿qué es esto? Y ese momento, ahora yo digo que bueno que pasé por eso, porque me ha hecho reafirmar unas cosas y me ha hecho, yo creo que ha creado un monstruito nuevo en mí. Y me ha hecho profundizar en muchas cosas y ver la realidad, porque uno desde Puerto Rico tú dices, no, mira, pues sí, yo no creo que Puerto Rico deba ser Estado, pero pues tú dices, pues maybe, no sé, exacto, es tan malo, qué sé yo, pero cuando tú estás aquí y tú ves cómo se vive aquí, tú ves cómo la gente de aquí ve a Puerto Rico, tú dices, Puerto Rico no debe ser Estado.
And so with that, I want to conclude that this interview that I had with Velez was very insightful to me because I've known her all my life. I see how she has developed as a person, as a woman. And I also saw, like, you know, what were her political stance before then. And seeing that development of, you know, changing these political positions or being a little bit more radical due to the fact that she had unfortunate experience just teaches that we are able to change our perspective in things. It doesn't matter at what point in our life we are going through. And also her migration stories, her sentiments against the United States, the bad education system, the bad health system. I just want to reiterate that everything stems from colonialism. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thanks, Adriana, for such an enlightening presentation. I will now invite Cheryl Hansen to give her presentation at this time.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so the project, it started as an oral history assignment for a Latin American studies course. And when we were tasked with doing a feminist oral history, I immediately wanted to use my mother, Lisa, as the subject of my oral history assignment because I had grown up listening to her tell me stories about her childhood and about her life before me. And some of them I heard so many times, yet I knew that if I did an oral history, I would be able to look at them through a different and new lens, and it would allow me to better understand her experiences and how they changed the trajectory of her life. So to start with some background biographical information about my subject, Lisa was born outside of Seattle, Washington in 1967, but her family moved to Virginia when she was a baby, and this meant that Lisa spent the majority of her childhood and adolescence years growing up in Culpeper, Virginia, which at the time looked like a very stereotypical small town in the South, meaning that it was really rural and pretty conservative. After that, she attended college at James Madison University and graduated in 1990. So after graduating from college with a bachelor's degree in English literature and psychology, she didn't really know what career she wanted to pursue. So instead, she decided to move abroad. And she eventually ended up settling in Prague, Czechoslovakia, where she got a job as an English teacher. Until she eventually returned back to the United States and moved to Maryland, where she was raising her children. And since then, she has over 20 years of experience working as an ESOL teacher in a local high school. And in this position, she works directly with Latinx immigrant communities in Maryland. So in addition to the role as a traditional teacher, Lisa is passionate about her role as the school's diversity, equity, and inclusion liaison and the school's student government association sponsor. So knowing her background, my project was inspired by our course material on labor rights movements led by women and females who challenged the traditional views of women in the workplace. And given that teaching is such a female-dominated profession, especially in the United States, through my oral history assignment, I really wanted to understand how her own experiences have influenced her work both as a teacher and as an advocate. So next slide, please. Okay, so then through our series of interviews, I quickly discovered the importance of cross-cultural interactions that were facilitated by living abroad and the development of her values of female empowerment and advocacy that are evident in her work in the Latinx community. So living abroad for many people can be a very transformative experience, and this was the same for Lisa. And through many of the experiences and interactions she had, she was exposed to diverse perspectives which really allowed her to reflect and think critically about her own values. And it caused a sort of paradigm shift in what she thought was right. So, in order to understand this shift, it's really important to understand the historical context of the time that she was abroad. So, she was in Prague in the summer of 1990, which at the time there was like a lot of tension going on between the United States and other countries, largely due to the Gulf War and the US troops that were occupying Iraq. Um, so she was in Prague in the Eastern Bloc, and it was really interesting for her because she felt like she was one of the few Americans there, and many of the people that she met had all of these preconceptions about America, and she had preconceptions about them as well. So it was really interesting to get like these interactions, and she was exposed to like varying viewpoints and new perspectives that really challenged the way that she grew up. And although the whole time she was there, she like started questioning it from the beginning. It didn't really click until it didn't really click for her until about 6 months into living there. And this is when she like had a really impactful experience. So one night when she was in the car with some friends, she learned that one of them was from Palestine. And at the time, this was a big deal because of the tension going on, and there was a lot of like media and just bad representation and misrepresentation about Palestinians to the United States citizens. So she had these preconceived notions about who he was. So immediately after figuring out that he was from Palestine, she decided to have them stop the car, and she got out and walked home just because she was scared. And then but after a few months, like she slowly became friends with him and realized that she was holding a lot of prejudices, and all of the information that she was getting from the United States might not have been the whole story. And this was really an eye-opening experience for her because it increased her awareness and made her start questioning some of the things that she learned when she was little and some of the things that she really took for granted. So one of the next slide, please. Okay, so one of the biggest paradigm shifts that occurred based on her time living abroad was this understanding of gender roles. And this was largely due to the thought that if she had this generalization about her friend from Palestine, then maybe other generalizations that she had too could be wrong. So Lisa's early gender socialization was really influenced and the development of traditional gender roles. So she was growing up in a small conservative town, and although her parents were pretty progressive for the town, they still subscribed to traditional gender roles, especially as they related to gender and work. This meant that growing up, even though Lisa's family didn't really have a lot of money or a lot of resources, her father always was the only person who worked, and he insisted that it was his responsibility and his responsibility alone to provide for his family, since he had this view of being the man of the house. And this just meant that her father was like a pilot for the airlines, and her mom, like the majority of the other moms in the town and the other moms that she knew, never really held a steady job or a formal employment, and she was just a stay-at-home mom. And this family value was so ingrained in Lisa that when she like started to get older and started to think about her own life, she wasn't really interested in careers, and all she wanted to do was be a mom, and she just assumed that she would eventually be a stay-at-home mom and never really thought about herself or women in general as professionals. And one thing that was really interesting to me was, even though she had this idea that she was just going to be a stay-at-home mom, she still always understood that she was going to go to college, but she kind of expected it to be like she described it as like a Cinderella story, which is like what her mom had. And it's where you go to college and you meet a guy, and then you're going to get married and have kids. And the college is just a step basically to get to like marrying, but it's not to further her professional goals. So this was like what she was going into. Like when she went abroad, this is what she was thinking, and she still hadn't really made up a decision about career paths or anything, which was part of the reason that she wanted to go abroad. And it really shifted her views because for the first time she was like living on her own and she was really independent and had to provide for herself. And she realized that she was able to have like a job in a profession that she really enjoyed. And then this impacted her when she came back to the United States because she was able to know that she could pursue both a family and a job at the same time. And this is something that's really reflected in her work with a lot of her students because many of her students have a similar idea of her when she was younger, and they want to have kids and they are really excited about like being moms and having families, and their careers or school isn't necessarily as important to them. So she really makes an effort to be more empowering to her female students, to encourage them to think about other things in addition to just families and stuff. And then, okay, sorry, next slide. So then the second main shift that occurred because of her newfound interest in education when she was abroad is that she started questioning some of the United States education system and some of the things that she grew up and the education system she grew up in were perpetuating. And as she reflected on her own experiences, she realized that there were a lot of inequities that she didn't even notice when she was a kid. And one of the biggest ones was when she was growing up, her education system was largely segregated. So she was in a very small town that was conservative, as I mentioned. And in elementary school and in middle school, all of the students went to the same schools and stuff. And then, however, when she got to high school, the students became separated more, and her and her white peers would go on to like a traditional local high school, whereas many of the African American students would go to vocational schools and learn specific traits. And even the ones that did go to like her local school, they would not be in higher level classes. They would only take like regular classes. And this was something that like upon reflecting on it, she realized how wrong this was, and how when she got involved in teaching in the United States, it was something that she really wanted to address and make the education system a lot more accessible to people that are generally marginalized in the education system. And this revelation has really allowed her to become passionate about especially making it accessible to her students. And this was very evident during the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic and the school closures. Because so as many of the schools were closing, a lot of and the pandemic was starting, a lot of the Latinx communities in Maryland, as well as across the country, were experiencing disproportionately high rates of adverse effects of both the coronavirus and the resulting economic crisis. And this was due to many things. For her students especially, they were living in one of the highest positive rates in the county, and they were still considered essential workers, so they were going to work while the pandemic was spreading, which caused many of her students to get the virus in the beginning of the pandemic. And also they were disproportionately affected by the coronavirus and experienced significant high rates of job insecurity and food insecurity and housing insecurity, which overall led to a lot of less income, and many of her students were struggling to pay rent or to get food and other necessities. So in order to address this, our education system in the county was trying to help bring lunches and food to the students that usually received free and reduced lunches. but that were not able to receive it because the schools were closing. However, with her awareness, she was able to realize that the students were unable to access the needs, the services that the school was providing, just because like the pickup location was so far from their houses and they didn't have the time or the transportation to get there. So her and other teachers were able to identify the students that needed the food the most and put together programs and organize teachers and students and community members to deliver the food to the students, just to take off one more burden. And then just for a conclusion of the interview in general, and just my main takeaways from the interview are that advocacy really comes from a place of awareness, and she was able to build this through the cross-cultural interactions she had abroad, which were essential in increasing her understanding of the injustices around her. And this allowed her to develop the values of female empowerment and realize the inequities in the education system and allow her to be an advocate for her students and accessing resources. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cheryl, for such an impactful presentation on the female immigrant experience. Our final presenter is Marta Dominguez.
Sí, muy buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon to everyone. My presentation will be in Spanish.
A translation for English. You can go ahead and click the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom. So I'm going to start. Mi trabajo es sobre los roles.
My work is about gender roles and how this affects about feminism personally and about the individual. To begin, to be able to know about the person that I chose about my oral history, it's my mom. Her name is Ofelia Luya. She was born in Peru. She was born in a small town of Huancayo, outside of a big city. And we don't know a lot about Peru. Huancayo is in the center of Peru, about 4 hours from Lima. She moved from the town that she lived to the city of Huancayo when she was 11 years old. And it's a city where she, as an adult, she began her career as a journalist and continued doing her job as a writer. Just like now, she immigrated to the United States in 2003 when she was 32 years old. And many of you will ask, why am I focused on this person? This, obviously, she's my mother. And I view her as a feminist image for all her work as a journalist and that she continues doing as an author. During the interview, she talked to me about her ideals, gender roles that men and women have. The idea that she has and her ideal is that there are no differences. From very young, she learned that the women were capable of doing domestic work, manual labor, just like, and her house, her father was not present. He had gone to the United States to help his family. So she had 6 sisters. And at home, it was only the sisters and the mother. There's where she begins to form her ideas about women being capable of everything because there were no
en las tareas del hogar que tenían que hacer. Pero por el otro lado, a la escuela, desde una educación muy temprana, le empezaron a instruir los roles tradicionales, como por ejemplo, las niñas tenían que coser, tenían que aprender a tejer, pero los niños estaban más envueltos en actividades como intelectuales, como pintar o hacer arte y todo eso, a pesar de que tenían una educación combinada sobre los cursos generales de matemática y comunicación, al final del día siempre se separaban los dos para aprender sus diferentes roles como niños y como niñas. Entonces, estos dos mundos como que son diferentes y causan un conflicto en las ideas que ella tiene. Y es por eso que ella crece muy confundida, y también aquí vemos el aspecto de la educación como un sistema muy antiguo que enseña los roles tradicionales y que está integrado en el currículum. Y esto es como una interrupción a la formación de Ofelia y sus ideales. You can go to the next slide. Y ya moviéndonos más al futuro, cuando empieza su carrera como periodista y en la ciudad de Huancayo, ella ve que no hay una representación suficiente de mujeres en el periodismo y específicamente en la investigación, porque la mayoría de veces ella ve que las mujeres son usadas como imágenes de las compañías, como presentadoras. Entonces eran como el objeto que representaba a las noticias. Y entonces ella emprende esta carrera de investigación con un poco de timidez, ya que su género le limitaba a los roles o a las posiciones de trabajo que ella podía tener como periodista, porque la mayoría eran varones y ella era una de las cuantas que estaban en esa carrera de investigación. Y al ser periodista de investigación en la ciudad de Huancayo, se tiene que mantener una relación muy cercana con los policías, porque en esa ciudad las noticias se tienen que contar al momento, muy rápido, la exclusividad y todo eso. Y entonces la información se obtiene muchas veces de los policías, porque eso les ayuda a mantener una imagen favorable. O sea, los periodistas y los policías trabajan juntos, mientras que los policías obtienen una imagen mediante los periodistas hacia el público. Los periodistas obtienen la información que necesitan para hacer sus trabajos. Y entonces, al tratar de obtener esta información, las mujeres periodistas se ven en una posición muy desfavorable, porque también las posiciones de los policías son tomadas mayormente por hombres, y entonces ahí también se ve una diferencia entre el poder, las posiciones de poder de un policía contra una periodista mujer. Entonces, ellas se ven forzadas a usar métodos que obviamente no son muy cómodas para ellas para obtener la información que necesitan para hacer su trabajo. Y es por eso que yo incluí en sus propias palabras de Ofelia, que dijo: tenías que usar tus encantos para obtener las noticias. Entonces vemos aquí cómo a la mujer periodista se le ve como un objeto en frente a los policías varones. Y esta relación que tienen las mujeres con los varones fue muy diferente a lo que Ofelia observaba con la relación de los policías varones con los periodistas varones, porque entre ellos la información fluía y no había ningún obstáculo. Y esto también les ponía en riesgo a las mujeres de sufrir acoso sexual en el trabajo. Y como podemos ver aquí, Ofelia me comentó que ella sufrió acoso sexual en el trabajo, y ella tuvo que callar porque en ese tiempo no había una comisaría que defendía el derecho de la mujer ni nada de eso. Entonces ahí también ella se da cuenta que no existe un sistema donde que ella no puede apoyarse o no puede refugiarse. Y es por eso que cuando entró un nuevo general a la Policía Nacional, ella y las compañeras mujeres periodistas insistían en la apertura de un centro de emergencia de mujer que podía proteger a la mujer de algún abuso. Y entonces Ofelia emprendió este trabajo de insistir a este general, cada entrevista que ella tenía con esta persona, cada evento que lo veía, siempre aprovechaba y decía, ¿cuándo van a abrir este centro? ¿Cuándo van a abrir este centro? Y esto específicamente en Huancayo. Y después de la insistencia y la presión de la prensa, específicamente de las mujeres, el centro se abrió por primera vez en Huancayo en 1998. Y quiero notar que 1998 no es mucho tiempo atrás, es como 22 años atrás. Y no, es muy sorprendente de que esto haya tomado mucho tiempo para que haya recursos para las mujeres en esta ciudad. You can go to the next slide. Y entonces todas estas experiencias que tuvo Ofelia, la mayoría negativas con los hombres, ahí es cuando ella empieza a tener sus ideologías o sus pensamientos negativos sobre los hombres, ya sea inconscientemente o conscientemente. Por ejemplo, ella decía que los hombres eran una interrupción o un obstáculo para el crecimiento y desarrollo de la mujer, como mencioné anteriormente, los policías eran como un obstáculo para que ella llegara a la información que necesitaba para hacer su trabajo. Y es por eso que ella también dice, me empiezo a preguntar, ¿qué pasó entonces? ¿A qué mundo es que tengo que enfrentar yo? Y empiezo a tomar decisiones radicales para mi futuro. Y yo incluí diseño porque otra vez vemos que el mundo ideal que ella tenía colapsa en frente a las experiencias que ella obtuvo y que la realidad era muy diferente y muy dura a la que ella se imaginaba. Y es ahí donde que ella toma la decisión de ser una madre soltera, ya que no quería ningún hombre que molestara su tranquilidad o que sea el obstáculo para ella. Es por eso que el ideal de ella es que las mujeres deberían ser empoderadas para no soportar abusos en contra de sus derechos. Mediante su trabajo como escritora de poemas, quiere demostrar que las mujeres sí pueden y también inspirarlas a que se empoderen. You can go to the next slide. Y entonces al final de todo este trabajo, los temas principales son los siguientes. Primero es respetar los límites de la otra persona cuando se hace este tipo de entrevista. Como mencioné anteriormente, Ofelia me contó que sufrió de acoso sexual en el trabajo, pero ella no quiso darme más detalles. Entonces ahí pude notar que ella no quería revivir ese trauma que sufrió. Y entonces es siempre respetar eso y también analizar cuáles son los aspectos que le previenen a seguir hablando sobre estas experiencias. Lo segundo es que estos tipos de experiencias nos ayudan a entender y a estudiar las diferentes dinámicas de la cultura y cómo los sistemas más grandes pueden afectar al nivel individual. En este ejemplo, era como el sistema de la relación entre el periodismo y los policías afectaban a ella y también como la educación le afectó a la vida de Ofelia y sus ideologías. Y a la misma vez aprender sobre las cosas que necesitan cambios y que necesitan promover, como por ejemplo abrir más organizaciones y proveer más recursos para las mujeres en la ciudad de Huancayo. Y eso concluye mi presentación. Muchas gracias por escuchar.
Thanks so much, Marta, for shedding light on the experiences of women in the workplace in male-dominated fields. We will now move to the question and answer segment. So I don't believe we have any questions at the moment. So I will just start with a comment. I found it very interesting that there was this common sort of thread in the presentations relating to oral histories And I find the oral histories can be seen as a remedy to notions of rupture because it builds this sense of community among women, an imagined community of women who are sort of learning from each other. And through this process, unlearning, as you all mentioned as well. So could you speak a bit about the importance of these oral histories, especially for marginalized communities, especially for women?
I can start with Vela's experience, and I think it's just gives voice to a person who had only had bad experiences in the imperial United States. I haven't gone through that because, you know, we have difference of color. I'm white and she's trigueña, basically. And so like I can sense like those differences that happens, both of us being Puerto Rican, you know, and it kind of like the oral history kind of gives her that space to express her experience and to also target situations in society and political relations that son influyente en esto, like they influence every aspect in our lives.
Yeah, and just to add off of that, I just wanted to say that I like it because facts are really interesting and they give you like a lot of information, but sometimes the oral history, you feel connected to a person and it's more personal. So sometimes they like stick with me because I feel their experiences more.
Yeah, and something that I found interested in my work too is that to see how the bigger history, the bigger picture is affecting an individual because individuals have different experiences, have different upbringings. So it's really important to highlight their voices because sometimes they're not going to speak until you ask them to speak. So it's really important to highlight their voices and their experiences.
Exactly, well said, giving a voice to those who may be considered voiceless. I have a question for Cheryl. I thought it was interesting as you looked at the transformative effect of migration, especially on women, how it engenders this feminist awakening. Could you speak more on that transformative effect of migration that you discussed in your presentation?
Yeah, sure. She had, from my understanding, is there were a lot of like different experiences that she had abroad, and just living, and she lived in a few other places too. But it was just eye-opening because it kind of made her see another culture. And then when she like got back to the United States, she was able to, it like separated her more and gave her like the process of unlearning, I guess, that we were was like common theme throughout.
Okay, great. We have a question that Sarah will now read to everyone. Sarah, you may go ahead.
Yes, so thank you to our three presenters. Great presentations. This question comes from Dr. Lisa Carney, and she says, you all have a personal relationship to the women you interviewed. I would love to hear your reflections on how you think your relationship impacted the conversation and what they chose to focus on when they talked to you.
So for me, in my interview with Vele, it was very funny because it wasn't kind of like an interview. It was more of us having a conversation because due to her being in Georgia and I'm being in Maryland, we don't talk that often. But when we do, we can go for hours, and we kind of got into heated discussions. And you know, I believe that it was very transparent because she was in a space with me that she knows she can trust me. And I just thought it was really fun because she didn't specifically cite it as an interview. It was more conversational. Let's fight, but let's also love each other. It was nice.
For me, one thing I noticed was that since my interviewee was my mom, I had heard like a lot of the stories before, but I was able to like ask different questions to get more of like I guess like to learn more about things that she wouldn't have like thought about. But then another thing that I noticed was a few times she would like go on tangents with like advice for me, kind of like, oh, this is what I learned. And I think that was because I was like her daughter. So that was kind of funny to think about at the end.
This is something that I kind of mentioned at the end when my mom was telling me about her experience suffering from sexual assault. Um, she was kind of limiting herself, so maybe it was because of the relationship that I had with her. Maybe she didn't want to tell me that because I was her daughter, and perhaps I also had like this bias entering the conversation or like the interview that I had with my mom, because I would never thought that my mom would go through this. And it was a learning experience, and it was really important for me to learn more about my mom, and I would have not done it if I didn't do this assignment.
Thank you. We have a question in the Q&A from Veronica, both in Spanish and in English, and this is for Martha. So she says, gracias Martha por tu presentación. ¿Sabes si actualmente hay más centros que protegen a la mujer en Huancayo o en todo el Perú? ¿Fue el acoso sexual una de las razones que llevó a Felia a migrar a los Estados Unidos?
Sí, muchas gracias por tu pregunta. En la actualidad, sí hay organizaciones y más centros.
There are organizations and centers of women in Huancayo. There is a police station exclusively for families, and there they take priority for women. But there are more work to do. And in all of Peru, there are rural areas where these centers have not been established. They're more concentrated in the city. And sexual harassment was not the reasons that Ophelia immigrated to the US. It was more for economic reasons. Being a journalist was not a career that paid a lot, and so it was for economic reasons that she moved to the United States.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to enter a question into the Q&A box? I had a question for you all. I really enjoyed your presentations. Thank you so much. And I wanted to know, because you talked about 3 individual cases and are looking at them as kind of a collective history, if you could talk a little bit about maybe how you think, is it the same kind of learning that comes from maybe a forced migration versus a voluntary migration, or a migration based on economic reasons versus a migration based on kind of limited or kind of a colonial experience?
So I kind of got lost in your question, but I think I understand what you were saying. I feel like it doesn't matter when you're migrating. At least for me, I voluntarily left, and Gloria, she voluntarily left. Even though there were some economic things, you know, I spoke in my project, Puerto Ricans migrate to the United States as part of colonialism. We're living voluntarily, but we're also living forced, because gentrification, the economic system, the healthcare, everything is essentially with that colonial relation with the US is pushing everybody to go out of the island. And so I feel like wherever you go, there's a piece of your motherland with you. And that's always so sad to like leave. And you always think about it and you're like, damn, that's my culture. Because you're going into the place where you don't know how you're going to be perceived or accepted or be comfortable with. So that's always a really big struggle. And I believe it doesn't matter if it's voluntarily, if it's forced, it's always going to be a struggle. And it's, for my experience, it doesn't get better because you love your motherland, you know, you don't want to leave. Or even if you do, you still love it. You know, I hope I explain well.
Yes, absolutely. And I think your point was really interesting, that maybe those things can coexist, right? Be forced and voluntary. I don't know if any other of the panelists wanted to comment.
Yeah, I think kind of like separating voluntarily and involuntarily is kind of hard because of the reasons of my mom. She migrated because she was not getting paid. She had to like pressure people to like HR to get paid. So I think that goes back to like the bigger picture. Like even though she voluntarily migrated to the United States and looked for better opportunities, she kind of was forced to because she was not getting paid. The economic situation in Peru was not getting better. So it's kind of like both ways.
Absolutely. Thank you. Would anyone else like to contribute a question?
I just have a question for, I guess, everyone, but perhaps Adriana may be able to answer this. So what strategies have racialized subjects pursued in the struggle against racism or sexism in the United States? Because I feel that you were talking a bit about that experience and that notion of unbelonging. Ike to us is a key, you're not belonging here. How do they sort of create their own space, or I guess in this surrogate homeland that is not welcoming, that's a bit hostile? Yeah.
So I feel like it has to do with when the people that you have around in the workplace or at home, or people that you find eventually when you stay at the United States. For example, taking the example of Velez wasn't completely alone, because even though she left alone, she also left with her partner, you know, her friends, whatever. And you had that part of home bit with you, even though the person was in Atlanta and she was in Savannah, you still have something that is pulling you to stay and making you work. And so I kind of forgot what you were asking, but essentially I feel like you create your own spaces. You know, when I migrated to the United States, I was by myself, I had nobody, but I was able to find like a group of good friends that made me feel like home, even though they're not Puerto Rican, they're Hispanic and all over, you know, Latin America. But it's still, you know, they hold you, they ground you, because you find people that love you eventually.
Thanks so much, Adriana.
Would anyone else from the audience like to ask a question? Feel free to post it in the chat or in the Q&A. Oh, here we go. Valeria Salcedo says, all of these are such important women in your lives. How does knowing the stories of these inspiring women change your perspectives, and how you will take this little piece of history with yourselves in your lives?
Okay, I guess I can go again. Guys, shut me up. It was definitely interesting because I lost touch with Velez for a long time, and that kind of like brought me back to her. You know, and now I try to weekly be like, hi, I love you, I hope you're okay, because you don't realize that these are people that are actually in your life and they impact you in a positive way in the past, and now they can still do that. What was the rest of the question? Also, like looking and analyzing it from like a big perspective on how my experience was very different from her, even though we're both Puerto Rican, you know, but like our skin color is different. Therefore, that gives you a perspective that race is not talked about in Puerto Rico. And I mentioned this with the tres razas thing, you know, we live with this idea that this is a thing, but when you go to a place that is heavy, like racialized, I guess, like you notice that there's difference, and then you started questioning your identity, and then you start forming spaces, and then you start accurately identifying yourself rather than being, you know, I'm equally parts African, Native, and Spaniard. Thank you.
Yeah, and for me, I feel like knowing her history more, or my mom's history, like more in depth, and just understanding this one piece of it really helps me understand like who she is today. And also, since she is my mom, I feel like her life choices have in turn affected mine so greatly that like I do understand a piece of like my history, I feel like, and just like my family history in general, that I think is really special.
I think for me, it kind of helped me also like create a greater bond, like beyond just being mother and daughter. We kind of like sometimes have discussions about like gender ideologies and like gender roles. And I think it's really important to do that with your mom or whoever you are with. And it also kind of like gave me a new perspective on like how women are treated back in Peru, and like just to see back in history. Now I just wonder how my aunt or how her mom kind of went through these societies like expectations, and that just makes me want to like learn more about my family history.
Thank you so much. Well, it looks like we're about up with the time. So I want to thank you so much to our presenters for sharing these great stories with us, and also to our attendees. I hope everyone enjoyed the first day of the conference, and I hope that you will join us tomorrow. We start at 9:45 a.m. with a talk on Job Talk Interrupted by Lisa Carney. And we'll have other really interesting events, an art panel, and as well our keynote speakers in the afternoon. So I hope you join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.